On October 7th, Israel will observe the first anniversary of the worst day of its 76-year history. On that day last year, Hamas broke out of the confines of Gaza and embarked on a killing spree that left nearly 1,200 people dead and thousands injured. 251 people were kidnapped and taken hostage, of whom several dozen remain captive. A nation was traumatized. Few Israelis were more than a few circles of acquaintance from someone directly affected. Israel's response, still ongoing, has been brutal. In Gaza, according to Hamas authorities, at least 41,500 people have been killed, tens of thousands more injured. Perhaps 1.7 million people of a pre-war population of 2 million have been displaced, forced to seek sanctuary in a tiny cloistered area in which there is nowhere to run. More than half of Gaza's buildings have been damaged or destroyed. In recent weeks, Israel has switched its focus northwards, seeking to remove the threat posed by the Iran-backed Lebanon-based faction Hezbollah, which began rocketing Israel last October 8th in sympathy with Hamas and had not let up since. Hezbollah itself has incurred a hefty toll. Its long-serving leader is dead, as is much of its high command, but Lebanese civilians are also suffering. More than 2,000 are dead, thousands more injured, hundreds of thousands displaced. Over the last 12 months, global sentiment has lurched from sympathy for Israel to horror over Gaza to a sense of powerlessness to stop things from getting even worse. 1 year on, do we have any idea how this ends? Did Israel really not have other options? And what might the Middle East look like now if they'd been pursued? This is the Foreign Desk.
We immediately started flooding back to the newsroom and trying to understand what exactly happened. And one of the surprises was how extensive the attacks were. But the assumption amongst many was that Iran or Hezbollah would come in also, that there would be a wider attack on Israel. Was this the beginning of this wider regional war?
We ruined the military abilities of the Hamas in Gaza. Now we are after ruining them politically, and it's impossible. They became a legend because of the 7th of October. You cannot ruin a legend. And this is the reason some of us have the feeling that any day this war continues without a deal of bringing the hostages back is harming Israel.
We hope that this change of the perception of our conflict will bring the international community to the point where they take a commitment that we will not go back to October 6th, that this enormous devastation, both in Israel and in Gaza, will create a launching pad for a change of the approach.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. We're joined, first of all, by Mairav Zonszein, Senior Analyst for Israel at the International Crisis Group. Mairav, this episode broadcasts a couple of days before that first anniversary of October 7th. What sense do you have of the kind of reflections that the anniversary will prompt in Israel?
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of the public, especially the public that has been protesting for a hostage deal and the families of the hostages themselves are not really interested in any kind of reflection. They're not interested in participating in any kind of state ceremonies. And I think they are at probably the worst point that they've been in the year, because now we're marking a year and there's really no ceasefire negotiations, no hostage deal talks at all. So that kind of sector of the Israeli public, I think, is in deep, deep despair and not necessarily interested in reflection, but interested in getting their families, their relatives out, and not really sure what tools they have at this point, because it's been completely overshadowed by Israel's invasion in Lebanon, and now it's pretty direct war with Iran. As far as the larger Israeli public, which includes the right wing, who are, I think, very much in favor of what Israel's doing, I'm not sure what kind of reflection they're going to be having. They're probably going to be congratulating the soldiers, the military, and the political echelon for crushing the enemy and moving forward. But I think obviously on an individual level, Israeli will be wondering when and how this is ever going to end.
I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu, as you've intimated, has been, I think, unswerving would be an understated way of putting it over the last year. And he has very much sought to frame, at least implicitly, this as kind of a sequel perhaps to 1967 to 1973, when Israel was compelled to fight a multi-fronted war for its survival against multi-pronged enemies, although in this case, rather than Arab states, it's Iranian proxies. But is that view commonly held among Israelis, perhaps especially in recent weeks, as the fact that this is essentially a conflict between Israel and Iran has become more open?
I mean, I would say that he would probably first and foremost compare it to 1948, to Israel's War of Independence. I think he actually said that in the beginning of this year of the war, that it's an existential war, that we're fighting for our existence. And I think at that point, a lot of Israelis, even though there was shock and trauma from what happened on October 7th, and there was no kind of attack like that ever on Israel, I don't think they thought that, Hamas had put Israel into an existential crisis. And ironically now, a year in, I think that with what's happening with Hezbollah and Iran, despite the fact that Israel has, dealt severe blows and the military intelligence has been impressive, I think to an extent Israelis are now even more so in an existential crisis, in the sense that they don't trust their own leadership, and they also understand that there is this ring of fire that is not easy to contain or control or deter or destroy, no matter how much the rhetoric about it goes overboard by the government. So, I would say that we're actually in a worse position, and I imagine many Israelis fear that they are in this existential crisis at this point. But it's not just about what's happening from the outside, it's also about what's happening from the inside. And it's really hard to convey to people outside of the country how significant it is that the hostages are still there, and that with all this impressive military technology and intelligence, they're not able or willing to prioritize that as the main war goal. And so that has really changed the way many Israelis understand what this country is about, what this government is doing, and whether their own interests are actually at heart in this whole thing.
I want to go back to kind of where we came in, which was obviously the events of October 7th last year. Very shortly after that, US President Joe Biden came to Israel and gave what I thought was quite an interesting speech. He did obviously pledge his support to Israel. He upheld Israel's right to defend itself, but he drew on the comparisons people were making between October 7th and September 11th, 2001 in the United States. And he said something to the effect of, I think, by all means, feel rage, but don't be consumed by it. He said to Israel, don't make the same mistakes we did. Why do you think Israel's government, Benjamin Netanyahu in particular, has proved so reluctant to heed that counsel?
I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. Probably one is that I think Netanyahu thinks that he knows better than anyone what needs to be done. I think he really believes that, but he's also interested in his own political survival, so that he has put front and center before anything else. He's also somebody who has been throughout his career aligned and identified with the Republican part of American politics and doesn't really agree or align with Democratic Party presidents. Even Biden, who I would argue is in some ways the most pro-Israel president Israel has ever had, potentially also the absolute worst president for this region ever. But, I think Netanyahu has made quite clear throughout this year and before that, and not just him, but much of the government and much of the base that has elected this government, that they're interested not in diplomacy or agreements or containment or de-escalation. And even those who might have gone that route before October 7th certainly would not go that route after. They consider those threats to be too big and the stakes to be too high. And, there is a real fear that if you kind of reach an agreement that they'll just regroup and do it again. I mean, that's a genuine, legitimate fear. But regardless, the notion is that the only way to move forward is through military force and through what Israelis call decisive victory, which again, I don't think is something that can be achieved through military force. And it's arguable that it really hasn't been able to be achieved in a year's worth of excessive military force. But I think that's the approach, that you can't make agreements with enemies, you have to crush your enemies.
Just finally, to pick up on one point you made there when you described Joe Biden as possibly the worst US president for the Middle East, is there anything he could have done differently? We're looking a lot in this program at paths not taken. Is it as straightforward as a lot of people have suggested that if he'd really wanted to restrain Israel, if he'd wanted to stop Israel acting as disproportionately as it has in Gaza, he could actually have done that?
I believe so, as far as the fact that we know that Israel cannot prosecute war for this strongly and this long without American weapons. That's simply a fact. So I would say yes. And I would say that the reason we got to October 7th to begin with is in large part the fact that Israel has been able to act with impunity for so long because the US, not just Biden, but consecutive presidents, have not taken steps within their own line of policy regarding settlements, two-state solution, all that stuff. And Biden came in not wanting to focus on Israel, but with very, very clear red lines. And all of those red lines have been broken, have been crossed. So unfortunately, his approach, whatever he thought, this bear hug approach, whatever he thought it would do, has led us now to the precipice of an Iran-Israel all-out war, regional war. He definitely should have put the brakes on this a long time ago, and I believe he could have. And now we're simply here as a result of him not doing that.
Mairav, thank you. That was Mairav Zonszein of the International Crisis Group in Tel Aviv. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. I'm joined now in the studio by Mina Al-Oraibi, Editor-in-Chief of The National in Abu Dhabi. Mina, first of all, let's go back to last October 7th, and with all due acknowledgement of the folly of trying to sum up the reaction of the entire Middle East to any one thing, is there a way you can characterise perhaps how those events landed in your newsroom as you started to understand what had happened in Israel on October 7th?
Of course, it happened over a weekend, and so many newsrooms were half-staffed, and very quickly we realized, no, this is going to be a major moment. And we knew, of course, there'd be major repercussions also, not only in Gaza, but on the region. So again, like every newsroom in the region, we immediately started flooding back to the newsroom and trying to understand what exactly happened. And one of the surprises was how extensive the attacks were and for how long the Hamas attack continued in Israel before measures were taken to stop it. And so as it started to unfold, what was clear was that this was an attack that was coordinated for quite some time. But the assumption amongst many was that Iran or Hezbollah would come in also, that there would be a wider attack on Israel because surely...
This was the beginning of something coordinated.
Yeah, there was an idea that it would be coordinated because surely for Hamas to take on such a bold attack, the response from the Israelis and the Israeli military was always going to be extreme. And so the idea was this the beginning of this wider regional war that Iran had often threatened with different proxies. And it seemed in the first few days that was not going to happen, that instead this was Hamas had been able to keep this under wraps because very few people even knew it was going to happen outside of Gaza. And perhaps that was the reason they were able to pull it off. So there were many, many questions being asked in those first hours, but there was a collective acknowledgement that this was a major moment.
Because that all touches on one, or what strikes me at least, as one of the great unanswered questions, and it is a question I have put to a lot of people and have not yet had a concise answer, really, which is, why did Hamas do this? Because, as you've correctly said, there was only ever going to be one level of Israeli response, as there always is, and it was obviously going to be of an order of magnitude even more severe than usual, given the scale of this attack. So Hamas presumably had some idea of what they thought this was going to accomplish other than what it has accomplished. Has it ever been clear to you what that is?
It's hard to understand how they thought the response would be anything but that. And the fact that they hadn't prepared their own people. You know, you have Gazans who have said, you know, there are no shelters, there are no tunnels. There wasn't even a stock of extra food or medicines or anything to try to get through an oncoming war. It's hard to understand what they thought would happen in the long term, but it isn't hard to understand why they did it, in the sense that it seemed that Israel and Saudi Arabia were moving towards a possible deal, and that in the minds not only of Hamas, but in the minds of many Palestinians, would have meant really the end of a pursuit of an independent Palestinian state. Saudi diplomats and officials insist that they would not have come to an agreement or a deal with Israel unless there was a clear path forward for a two-state solution. But they didn't say that they would make sure that there was a Palestinian state before signing a deal with Israel.
Is it also possible that Hamas surmised that that two-state solution that might have been part of a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia would have very little room in it for Hamas, whom, of course, the Saudis are not big fans?
Yes. And it's clear that Hamas were increasingly isolated from most Arab capitals. They were getting closer to Iran, who became their biggest backer. Of course, a major moment for Hamas was when the uprising in Syria happened and Hamas decided to take a position against the Syrians, moved both to Qatar and Turkey. And so there were different iterations of Hamas, let's say, but what was clear was that Hamas had become very close to Iran and was of a belief that they had to fight their way against Israel, that there wasn't going to be a peace accord that would have room for them, or frankly, that the current Israeli administration or the political factions in Israel appeared serious in terms of having a proper Palestinian state. Having said that, Hamas themselves, to this day, are at different ends of the spectrum from the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, which runs the West Bank. So you're right to question whether a deal between the Saudis and Israelis, even if it led to a Palestinian state, would have room for Hamas. And that is true. It's hard to know also what opportunity Hamas felt they had on that particular date, the 7th of October, 2023, where they felt they could actually carry out militarily that attack, that perhaps they wouldn't have that window in other times. And I think that's also something to take into account, that they may have had these plans and it was just when was the moment that they could actually strike, and they felt that that was the opportunity. So while the bigger geopolitical play may have been a greater motivator, Hamas has always wanted to put as much pressure or damage on Israel as possible. And it was that moment that they were able to carry out the attack. I think it was also very important for Hamas to be able to take away the idea that the Israeli Iron Dome, that the Israeli military, the Israeli intelligence was invincible. And they showed a weakness and a vulnerability in Israel that not only has affected, of course, the psyche of the Israeli population, but actually regionally, questions started to be asked about how strong really was this military intelligence that the Israelis had, and that up until that point had been able to deflect Hamas, Hezbollah, and others.
Nevertheless, though, is it fair, do you think, because this is just a thought that has struck me repeatedly over the last year, that interestingly, Israel's response to Hamas's attack seems, though obviously it has caused an amount of outrage and upset in the Arab world, it hasn't so much hardened Arab states against Israel as hardened Arab states against Iran. That has been the upshot of it, to the extent that when Iran launched that enormous aerial barrage at Israel, it was intercepted in part by Jordanian fighter planes and with the help of Saudi intelligence.
This is one of many complications of the region, because for many Arab states, they're between having to deal with Israel and the continued occupation of Palestine, which not only do the governments care about, but even more so their people care about. On the flip side, you've got Iran that works actively to undercut the sovereignty of Arab states like Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, where be it through paramilitary groups, be it through making pronouncements like we call the shots in four Arab capitals and so forth. And so I think the position of most Arab governments is that they don't want to see Iran in a position that it's able to call the shots in several Arab capitals and rising. And I think for the Jordanians, that moment to intercept was If they hadn't, then very soon you could see a downward spiral where Iran decides to send militants from Iraq through Jordanian borders to try to get to the West Bank. So I think for the Jordanians, this is another red line that's being crossed when it comes to their own sovereignty, that if they allowed it to happen, would likely lead to a further attempt to undercut Jordanian sovereignty. And so I think it isn't so much about they can live with Israel, but they can't live with Iran. It's more about how much of a threat is this for their own internal dynamics, and for the Iranians to be able to intercept their airspace. The fear is that the next step is that we'll intercept their land.
Just finally, I want to go back to what you were saying there about the degree to which Arab governments and Arab publics care about the Palestinian cause and a Palestinian state. I think it's certainly the case, or at least it has been my experience, that the interest in this among Arab publics is very genuine. Is it really the case among Arab governments? Specifically, do any of them, do you think, actually care enough to get directly involved in the construction, or in Gaza's case, reconstruction of a Palestinian state, should that be the option? Do they actually want this problem solved, or is this problem actually periodically useful to them as long as it continues?
Arab governments are a mixed batch,
to say the very least.
And so it really depends, which is not a cop-out, but it's to say, yes, traditionally you did have nationalist slogans being touted by governments of, frankly, dictators like Saddam Hussein of Iraq or Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, where they could use that as a rallying call and not deal with their own internal dynamics. I think it's less so now, in the sense that actually if you were able to solve this ongoing problem, to put it mildly, then there's much more possibility to push back against paramilitary groups being set up to claim to want to go and liberate Jerusalem. If you could actually liberate Jerusalem and if you could have a Palestinian state, then the rallying cry for a lot of these groups, be it the Houthis or be it Hezbollah, becomes much more disingenuous. So I actually do think that most Arab governments are invested in trying to find a solution. What that solution looks like, how they get to it, there you have a lot of difference of opinion. But genuinely, and again, from the officials I speak to, from different types of governments and political leanings throughout the Arab world, there is a recognition that you need to solve this. There's also a recognition that Israel is here to stay, and could they find a way to live and work with Israel. What's happened since October 7th and the way that the Israeli government has carried out this horrific war, it's going to make that much more difficult in the years to come. So I do think they care because it's such a destabilizing factor for the entire region. And even before October 7th, there were hopes that you could almost sidestep the Palestinian issue, but it always comes back and lands in the laps of everybody. And what the past year has shown us is that actually what happens in Palestine doesn't just stay in Palestine, it spreads. If you think about it, there have been 7 different Arab states that have had strikes on their country, one way or the other, since this all started. And so for that purpose, you realize that if you are invested in stability, then you need to resolve this issue, even if you're not thinking about it from a moral point of view, which you would hope they would be thinking about.
Mina Al-Oraibi, Editor-in-Chief of The National, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. I'm joined now in the studio by 2 former Israeli ambassadors. Ambassador Ilan Baruch is also chair of the Policy Working Group, an Israeli group that advocates for peace between Israel and Palestine. And Ambassador Alon Liel is also a former Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry. Alon, let's start with you. And again, let's go back to the hours, days after October 7th. If someone in Israel's government at the time had asked you, how should we respond to this? What would your answer have been?
A year ago, there was no such question. And we were under attack, traumatized. The only thing to do was to try and bring the hostages back, attack the Hamas people. It was clear that we are going to respond militarily. There was no other option. I think the dilemma started popping up 3-4 months later, when there were early voices to stop the war. I was not there yet. Many of my friends were not. And only after 7, 8, 9 months, the peace movement in Israel joined the idea that the war has to be stopped. And I think today, far beyond the peace movement, majority of Israelis supporting stopping this war. So it was a gradual process until we reached the point that we support stopping the war.
I'll bring you in, Ilan. Was it like that for you as well? Did you think early on that a military response to what Hamas has done is the only thing to do, and then started to wonder where we're going with this?
I think that a military response was almost inevitable, only that it has turned sour in the sense that the leadership in Israel played a political game rather than a military game. And the release of the hostages was not put up and in front of anything else. There was an element of retaliation, and there was an element of preserving the Israeli deterrence by the show of force. And it has turned brutal.
Alon, again, going back to that early stage, was there any argument, do you think, for more of a council of restraints? Obviously reinforce the border with Gaza, obviously announce for Israel that it would be targeting the people who had planned this, but keeping the moral high ground, the world sympathy that Israel held at the point immediately after the attacks. And I know that for all sorts of political and historical reasons, restraint of that kind was never likely. But if that had been observed at the time, would things now be better than they are?
The dilemma was if to enter boots on the ground or to encircle an attack from the air. Some of us thought it's a mistake to go in because we feared we will never go out once we go in. But I think there was a strong backing of the government and the military when they entered. And then Israel started worrying about its own casualties. There were lots of casualties. The Israeli public was obsessed with the 7th of October itself, everyday funerals. So I think until today, there is strong backing for what the army is doing, but question marks about the motives of the politicians and big protests about the fact that they care more about political survival than about bringing the hostages back. Also, the international criticism grew up all the time, and now we are at a point that Israel is much more vulnerable diplomatically than we were in the first month of the war.
But Ilan, again, from where we are now, nearly a year into this, is it clear to you yet what Israel's government regards as victory, like what it would take, what the conditions would need for them to be to say, okay, the military operation is now over? You know, are we just waiting for them to fish Yahya Sinwar out of which tunnel he's in so they can claim we've destroyed Hamas and we've won?
Yes, I think the issue is less quantitative and more principled. Defeating Hamas is actually defeating the Palestinians in the eyes of this government. And succumbing to a deal over the hostages was regarded, and is still regarded by the right wing in Israel, as a defeat of Israel rather than of the Palestinians. I thought so right at the beginning, and I think many people were in this view in Israel, that we should have first and foremost dealt with release of hostages for whatever price, to be paid in the sense of releasing Palestinian prisoners and delaying an air and ground attack. But the government went in an entirely different way, serving objectives that had little to do with the mathematics of conflict on the ground and had to do more with the strategic position of Israel in the Middle East and the position of the government in Israel itself.
Alon, do you get any sense, though, that Israel's government yet is thinking about what the day after is like? Because Gaza, mostly ruined though it already is, and suffering the casualties that it has, it will still be there. Nearly 2 million Palestinians will still be there. Do you get any sense of how Israel's government plans to deal with them or address them in future?
They deal with the day after every day, all the time, their own way, in a way that they cannot even express publicly. The day after is full Israeli control on Gaza, whether we are inside with forces or we encircle it and come in whenever we want, and even starting to begin on settlements in Gaza. This is the day after for most of our ministers, especially the extreme right ministers. This is something they cannot tell the world. What I don't think they deal with is the day after the day after. I mean, what to do next? Even if we gain control on Gaza, what are we going to do in the future when the exchange of fire is ending? So I think here our government doesn't know where it will go. It lives for the near future, and for the near future they want to have full control on Gaza unless somebody comes that we trust and can do it for us. But nobody else will come and do it for us. So the day after is we stay in Gaza.
Ilan, if that's, and I think it does seem like the case, what this Israeli government will do, what would be a better idea? Because we have heard, certainly from a lot of Israel's increasingly frustrated allies, an amount of wistful attempts to resuscitate the idea of a two-state solution, a Palestinian state of some sort in the West Bank and Gaza. Do you think from where we are that is still viable, that is something that probably a different Israeli government could actually work towards?
Very much depends on the third player, the international community. We have been, in a way, inverted commas, betrayed by the international community by downgrading the importance and the urgency by which the United States, the United Kingdom, France and others were prepared to pay attention to our conflict. Now you have two extreme views that are in contradiction with each other. In Israel, you find people who say, let's go to status quo ante, which means reverse the disengagement, go back to Gaza, create assets on the ground, and we will see how this plays out. The other way around is, let's look at the catastrophe in Gaza as a point of departure for an entirely new initiative, which is political, where the international community is involved, and where the Palestinian Authority is invited to reassert itself in Gaza. What we hear from our Palestinian partners is that the idea that Hamas will be obliterated and removed from the surface of the earth is an illusion. Hamas will be a heavyweight player in whatever comes, even if it's not represented at the table of government in Gaza, but nothing will be coming in without the consent of Hamas and rewards for Hamas.
But Alan, that point that Ilan raises, this idea of the Middle East having dropped off the radar of a lot of Israel's international partners and allies, is that not going to be even more the case in future? Because I think part of the reason for that is that those international partners and allies think, God, we have spent decades of time and energy and diplomatic capital on this. It never improves and nobody ever thanks us. And the situation is now more complicated even than it was a year ago.
Difficult to predict the future, but we can very well analyze what happened to us this year. Until a day before the war, Israel was in its best international standing ever. And we can analyze it as professionals with the Abraham Accords and everything, including the Middle East. And as a result, for 10 years, the issue was not on the international agenda at all.
Everybody thought the problem had been kind of managed.
No. Everybody was afraid to tackle Israel. Israel was strong, prosperous. It could react to any diplomatic move against it in a massive way. So countries were afraid to challenge Israel, to tackle Israel. So we were in a wonderful situation. Also economically, the last year has changed the situation. We suffered several diplomatic blows during this year, especially in the two international courts in The Hague and in the UN, in the Security Council, in the Assembly, by several countries, including Europeans recognizing Palestine, by sanctions against settlers and so on. We suffered some punches, not critical, but we are more vulnerable diplomatically now. The question is where we go from now on. If tomorrow we have a deal and we get the hostages back and we somehow manage to sit with some Palestinians around the table, then I think the punches will end. If the war will go on, maybe another year or two, and the bleeding of all sides, including Israel, will go on, it is endangering Israel too. The future of Israel, maybe not physically really, but spiritually, we will lose our moral ground because the war from now on is meaningless militarily. We ruined the military abilities of the Hamas in Gaza at this stage. Now we are after ruining them politically, and it's impossible. You cannot ruin them politically. They became a legend because of the 7th of October. You cannot ruin a legend. And this is the reason some of us have the feeling that any day this war continues without a deal of bringing the hostages back is harming Israel. And beyond it, even the Jewish community, because the Jewish community, including in Britain, is very much identified with what Israel is doing these days. And they're surprised here. Anti-Semitism is growing, but there is no surprise. With the number of casualties we inflicted on the Gazans and the whole region in Lebanon and in Syria, even in Yemen, this is a difficult burden to carry for a small country like Israel and for small Jewish people around the globe. So I think here also we meet the Jewish community that supports the government on going on. The Israelis and Jews abroad have to think it over again. This war from now on is very dangerous for the future of Israel.
Ilan, Alon there raises the prospect of, at some point, Israelis and Palestinians sitting at the same table. You were saying earlier that you don't believe that Hamas can be eradicated, as Israel insists that it can. But do you think that there actually is a reasonable prospect at any point in the next few years, say, of an Israeli prime minister or Israeli government officials at least meeting with representatives of Hamas? I mean, I know there's the old diplomatic saw that you make peace with your enemies, not with your friends, which seems to presuppose that at some point dialogue will have to occur. But is that not politically extremely difficult for any Israeli leader to say that I am going to sit down at a table with the people who perpetrated this monstrosity?
Yes, it is definitely an unfair expectation from the current leadership to sit down with Hamas. It's beyond imagination, and quite rightly so, and I would not have recommended wasting time on this. Peace is always intertwined with reconciliation. There is no reconciliation with Hamas. The bestiality of the attack on Israel is beyond repair. This cannot be simply removed from our side. But I want to take you to another question that relates to this. The paradigm that was ruling the international perception of the Israel-Palestine conflict was sort of containment. Let the two parties sort out their issues by themselves. And this was a tragic mistake. We cannot solve our issues on our own. The two parties are in a position where the very primary issues cause the outmaneuvering of each other rather than a compromise that leads to coexistence. And we believe that the international community, and this is the reason why we are here in London, and we were here also last year, and we are traveling extensively in Europe to push the international community into active and leading involvement. And we think we need to see a different approach towards the conflict coming from Washington and so on. When the Biden administration changed guards with Trump, we were given to understand that there are other priorities that preoccupy China, global warming, and so on. And then came in the war in Ukraine, and we were really pushed down the list of priorities. And that has a lot to do with what happened in Gaza. The Israeli government was enraged by a comment made by the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, that what happened in Gaza did not come in a vacuum. And he was right in a way. In a way, what you see on the ground is unacceptable from a Palestinian point of view, and quite rightly so. And we need to see a lot more. Now the Americans are involved they are really drowned in our conflict. American interests are being threatened, and European interests are being threatened, British. And we hope that this change of the perception of our conflict will bring the international community to the point where they take a commitment that we will not go back to October 6th, that this enormous devastation, both in Israel and in Gaza, will create a launching pad for a change of the approach. Once a change happens, the entire set of calculations on both sides, Israel and Palestine, will be different. And then you can see all sorts of positive, creative initiatives coming in. And in then, a Palestinian, I wouldn't say Hamas, but Palestinian-Israeli line of collaboration would be more acceptable publicly.
Ambassadors Alon Liel and Ilan Baruch, thank you very much for joining us here on the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. Please do also listen back to last week's episode 560, recorded live in the hours after the death of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and serving as part one of our Middle East-focused episodes ahead of the October 7th anniversary. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.
2024 is a defining year for global politics as more people head to the polls than ever before. How will shifts in power impact you? The Financial Times provides fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists provide impartial analysis of the economy, politics, and business, so you can join the dots and see the full picture. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.